Okay, so today we're going to talk about your immune system and specifically innate immunity. So this is also known as the inflammatory response. This is something that everyone should have unless you have a genetic deficiency where certain enzymes or chemicals or cells are not being made like they should be. Generally, everyone has this type of response that will allow your body to respond to a kind of broad spectrum of different types of potential pathogens, but it's not specific. That is more acquired immunity, which we talked about in class, which is our ability to respond to very specific kinds of pathogens. Innate immunity is sort of a broad spectrum, kind of a blanket type of response to really any kind of injury or pathogen. So our bodies are pretty much constantly under attack by different kinds of pathogens, right? These could be bacteria, it could be different types of fungal spores that can be pathogenic and disease-causing. Viruses, of course, right? We're all well aware of that, being that we've lived through this pandemic with coronavirus. So these are different kinds of microorganisms that can be potentially, attacking us from the outside. We also have to remember, right, part of our body is always open to the outside world, right? That's our mouth, right? So we're breathing in air coming from outside into our lungs, but our digestive tract is open essentially on both ends. We're basically, it's a tube that's outside of our cells, even though it's inside our body. It's a little bit weird to think about, but that's basically what's going on. So acquired immunity, this is what we're going to talk about in class, specific recognition of a specific type of pathogen using different kinds of receptors. And this is something that is going to involve the production of antibodies, as well as the production of particular types of cells, the cytotoxic lymphocytes, or AKA cytotoxic T cells, that are going to destroy any cells that have been infected. So you have a true two-prong infection management or approach in acquired immunity. You're dealing with already infected cells, and you're also preventing future infection by using antibodies. The innate response is different. Like I mentioned, this is a broad spectrum response, and it's fast. So acquired immunity, as I was mentioning in class, this can take up to 2 weeks for full response. Innate immunity is almost immediate. It's a very fast response, which again, if you have allergies that generate anaphylactic shock, that is part of your, basically your innate immunity gone a little bit haywire, and your body is responding to something that's not a pathogen as if it was a pathogen, and it can generate, swelling and a large-scale response in a very short period of time that can lead to breathing problems and other issues. And I'll talk about that here in just a second. So we have basically two types of defenses. We have barrier defenses. These are, again, preventative measures to prevent pathogens from coming inside our tissues. So those include skin, mucous membranes in various types of openings like our nose and our nasal passages, and different kinds of secretions that I will again talk about here in just a second. We have antimicrobial proteins that are floating in our blood plasma all the time. They're called complement proteins, and we'll talk about more of those in just a second. You have, again, the inflammatory response, which is triggered mostly by histamine. And we have different types of cells that are constantly patrolling our body, looking for different kinds of invaders, looking for basically proteins or cells that should not be there, right? They're things that are not us, that should not be present. And so those cells are again, responding to a broad variety of different kinds of proteins and molecules but they are not super specific. So the first type of defense, as I mentioned, are barrier defenses. This is basically keep things out that shouldn't be able to come in the first place, right? This is kind of your first line of defense. So I'm talking about just animals in general. Obviously, we don't have a chitinous exoskeleton or a shell, but other kinds of animals do. Even plants have an outer waxy layer on their tissues called the cuticle that makes it harder for pathogens or other things to get into their tissues. Our skin, in addition to being a physical barrier, has a pH of about 3 to 5, so we are somewhat acidic in terms of our exterior environment, the surface of our skin, and that's something that's generally not going to be terribly great for a variety of different types of microorganisms that don't function in that pH range. We have, as we were talking about, especially in our nasal passages and our lungs, right, we have mucus that's produced all the time at a low level, and cilia, and those are trapping, the mucus is trapping any particles that we're breathing in. Again, they could be pollen, it could be things that are relatively harmless unless you, again, have allergies. But it also could be, right, anything that's potentially harmful, mold spores or airborne bacteria or viruses, all those kinds of things should get trapped in the mucus. And then we have the cilia that are moving that mucus, right, this is the mucus escalator, up our trachea and over, basically pushing it over into our esophagus, and we'll swallow it, and then it goes to our stomach where it's exposed to a pH of 2, which destroys not everything, but almost everything. It's difficult to survive that type of environment. So again, a lot of our other body secretions, things like saliva, our tears, not only may have a somewhat nasty pH, but also often contain antimicrobial proteins. So these are, for example, the lysozymes we've talked about a couple of times in the course. These are proteins that exist in our tears, and our tear ducts are being produced in our and the lubrication of our eyes, that because we don't have a really big blood supply to our eyes in certain parts of them, and so it makes it a little harder to deal with foreign particles. So lysozymes, again, are enzymes that are going to attack and usually open up pores in, for example, bacterial cell membranes, which would open up essentially an artificial aquaporin, let water, flood in, which is going to lead to lysing of the bacteria, right? Because they're hypertonic cells, and their water is going to move in if you open up these extra pores. So lysozymes are dealing with some of those microbes in our body secretions, and as I mentioned, of course, things like acid and other kinds of molecules. So if a pathogen manages to get past those defenses, so they manage to survive your digestive tract, they manage to not get trapped in the mucus, and now they've basically breached that body barrier, we have to have cells to deal with these kinds of invaders, and those cells are known as leukocytes. These are also known as white blood cells because it's a very, very, I shouldn't say very broad, there are lots of different kinds of leukocytes, and some of them, a smaller category, lymphocytes, we talked about when we talked about acquired immunity. So those are B cells and T cells. Those are lymphocytes. We're not going to talk about those today. Those are part of our acquired immune system, but they do help recruit our innate immune system, which I will talk about here in just a second. So leukocytes are generally going to be responding to a broad spectrum of different types of pathogens. Okay, so as I mentioned, leukocytes in general, again, lymphocytes are a little bit different. They have very specific receptors, and that's part of our acquired immune response. But most leukocytes have receptors on their outer cell membrane that recognize molecules found in sort of, as I mentioned, broad spectrum categories. So This could be double-stranded RNA, different kinds of proteins that are commonly found in bacteria, some proteins that are found in fungi, some proteins that are found in viruses, different kinds of polysaccharides that may be on the surface of these different types of pathogens. So they can respond, if they recognize that, to again, a kind of broad class of pathogen. But of course, there will probably be pathogens, for example, possibly our novel coronavirus, that don't exhibit any of those molecules that are typically found on the surface of different types of microbes. So those would then sort of slip past our innate immune defense, and that's again where that acquired immunity really comes in handy, because you can be very, very specific as to what your body can respond to. So again, leukocytes are binding to kind of commonly found molecules on the surfaces of different kinds of viruses, bacteria, and fungi. And how they respond is different from our lymphocytes, which are then activated and perform particular functions like making antibodies or triggering cell death through triggering chemical apoptosis. In most of our leukocytes, we have three main categories that we're going to talk about. There are others that we just don't have time to get to. But most of them respond by basically wrapping the offending pathogen in membrane, so phagocytosis, and bringing it inside the cell, right? And they then may break off a piece of that and express it on the surface of their MHC, their major histocompatibility complex, so that if a B cell or T cell, particularly a T cell, has receptors that match that particular pathogen, they can help activate our acquired immunity as well. But their main job is identifying basically proteins and particles that are in common with broad class of potentially infectious or pathogenic microorganisms, and neutralizing them by essentially eating them. That's basically what phagocytosis means. It means cell eating. So you're going to wrap it in membrane and bring it inside and then break it down, right, with different types of hydrolytic enzymes. And so here we've got a wonderful scanning electron microscope image of a macrophage. These are sort of your typical white blood cells that we think about. And it's stretching out, right? It's basically changing its shape in order to consume all of these bacteria. And it can do that, right? All these little arms, those are projections in their cytoplasm of our cytoskeletal system, right? Those microtubules or microfilaments are allowing the cell to change its shape in order to respond, in this case, to a bunch of rod-like bacteria that it's consuming. So neutrophils and macrophages generally wrap the offending particles in membrane and bring them inside and then expose them to hydrolytic enzymes. Again, as I mentioned, they often will also take part of that offending pathogen and express it on the surface of their MHC complex in order to help recruit our acquired immune system. Okay, so as I mentioned, our general class of white blood cells are going to respond in general to a variety of different kinds of proteins and other molecules associated with different classes of pathogens. So this is great for broad spectrum, but doesn't mean that they necessarily are as specific as they could be. And that's where our other types of leukocytes, our lymphocytes, right, our B cells and T cells come in. But again, we're not going to talk about them now because we talked about them in class. So neutrophils, right? These are, again, a type of leukocyte. They tend to be attracted to signals that are being given off by infected tissues, basically distress calls. You have infected cells are calling for help, and that's recruiting your neutrophils. It will also attract some macrophages. Macrophages are, again, circulating through our blood and our lymph. They can squeeze in between cells too, looking for things that don't belong, right? Looking for viruses, looking for bacteria, looking for things that should not be there, right? Non-self proteins. And again, those two are generally going to deal with anything that they find that is in the class of particles that they can bind with, are going to deal with that by phagocytosis. They're going to wrap it in a membrane, bring it inside, and use hydrolytic enzymes to deal with the problem. And then, of course, possibly express some of that on their surface in an attempt to recruit our T cells as part of our acquired immune system. Our last class of leukocytes that we're going to talk about are known as natural killer cells. And again, these guys are looking at patrolling through fluids, so our lymph and our blood system, also going in between cells. And they specifically are looking for proteins that are being expressed on the surface of infected cells. So they're looking for those cells that are sort of calling for help. But they're also looking for cells I refer to as cells behaving badly, basically. Cells that are expressing abnormal proteins on their surface as a result of infection or as a result of things that have gone wrong, like with cancer. So these guys are, again, watching for those cells that are not normal. And if they find them, right, then they either release chemicals to trigger apoptosis in the infected or cancerous cell, or they actually can lyse the cell. They can basically form a sharp projection with their cytoskeleton, right, with those microtubules or microfilaments, and essentially puncture the cell membrane of the infected cell or the cell that's expressing abnormal proteins. So hence the name natural killer. So other kinds of leukocytes, again, these are kind of our broad class of white blood cells, including neutrophils, macrophages, and natural killers. Other types of leukocytes produce interferons in response to signals from cells that are infected with a virus. And interferons are basically proteins that interfere with the function of the virus in the way that it helps prevent them from being able to infect other cells. So this essentially will short circuit the viral infection. These chemicals also help to activate macrophages, essentially attracting macrophages to an area where there is a potential viral infection going on. And of course, the macrophages show up and phagocytize any foreign particles that they find. In addition, infected cells, in addition to essentially calling for help and secreting chemicals that attract our leukocytes, they also can secrete interferons. And this basically helps the infection from spreading to nearby cells, so limits the spread of the infection. For the virus-infected cell, it's basically not good news either way, right? You're infected with a virus, which is not fun for that particular cell. But also the typical response by our natural killers, right, to in viral infected cells is to trigger programmed cell death, right? So trigger apoptosis or even lyse them in response. And of course, those signaling molecules may also attract, for example, those cytotoxic T cells, in which case the response is also apoptosis. So once you're infected, not so great for you, but you can certainly help your fellow cells by keep them from getting infected by secreting interferons. And of course, now we have the capability of, now that we've identified many of the genes that code for interferons, we can clone those genes and insert them into a plasmid and put them in a bacteria, like you guys did in the gene cloning labs, and have the bacteria make that particular chemical for us. And then we can concentrate it, package it, and use it to treat a variety of viral infections, right? Because remembering, viral infections are not going to respond to antibiotics, right, in general. Antibiotics are treat bacterial infections. And I say in general because you can have compounding effects. You can have a bacterial infection, for example, that makes you more vulnerable to a virus, and vice versa, because it's tying up the resources of your immune system. But yes, antibiotics affect bacterial cells and not eukaryote cells and not viruses. So another part of our innate immune response, in addition to our different classes of leukocytes, are what are known as complement proteins. We have about 30 different kinds of these proteins floating around in our blood, plasma, and our lymphatic system, and they're activated by contact with, again, those broad class of proteins and polysaccharides and other kinds of molecules that are found on the surface of a lot of potential pathogens like viruses, bacteria, and fungi. And these types of proteins often will lead to lysis of the microbe cell itself by basically creating an artificial aquaporin in the cell membrane of basically the pathogenic cell, opening it up so that water can flow in, and again causing the cell to lyse or burst. So these types of proteins are part of our innate immune response because, again, they're responding to those broad classes of different types of molecules on the surface of microbes, but they also can be activated by binding with antibodies. And so in that way that they're also part of our acquired immune response. And basically they're involved in both of those to defend us from pathogenic microorganisms. So the inflammatory response, I've been talking a lot about the innate immunity, and it's not exactly the same as inflammatory response, but inflammatory response is generally a common consequence of triggering our innate immune response. So innate immunity involves, right, those broad classes of leukocytes like neutrophils and macrophages and natural killers. It also involves these complement proteins, and quite often involves the production of histamine. Now, histamine is a local regulator, so this is a signaling molecule that basically doesn't have to travel a very long distance in order to cause an effect. It's generally causing an effect in its neighboring cells, but it essentially is a hormone, and it's stored in cells in our connective tissue. So we basically have histamine stored everywhere in our body. And so part of the effects of histamine are the dilation of blood vessels, so a similar response in some cases to other hormones that we've already talked about. And so by increasing blood supply to, for example, to an injured area, you're bringing in complement proteins, you're bringing in clotting factors, you're bringing in our white blood cells to deal with any infectious particles that might be present. So this is going to lead to swelling in the particular area that's affected, partially because of the dilation of blood vessels, but also because it increases the permeability, particularly the permeability of our capillaries, which are already a little bit leaky, as I mentioned when we were talking about the circulatory system during that EdPuzzle. They're already somewhat porous and allowing cells to leave and come back as they need to explore that interstitial fluid between the cells, and again to pick up any microbes that are stored there or neutralize any problems. So that tends to increase their permeability in reaction to histamine. So histamine basically tends to produce localized swelling and some other responses, as we will get to here in a second. So another effect of histamine is to attract and activate neutrophils and macrophages. So again, in response to an injury or signals from injured or infected cells, histamine is increasing blood flow to the affected area, increasing the permeability of those capillaries, and activating our leukocytes, our neutrophils and macrophages, to come to the aid of those cells in terms of consuming any infectious particles, but also possibly, dealing with those infected cells by producing other chemicals. So our activated leukocytes in turn are releasing signaling molecules that also, again, promote blood flow to the site. So that tends to increase the redness in an area that's been infected, right, or injured. Those signaling molecules are increasing the delivery of complement proteins, right? So that are always circulating in our bloodstream and our lymphatic system. Those are again going to bind to a broad class of pathogen membranes and open up those pores and cause them to lyse or otherwise interfere with the function of those proteins. And they, of course, can also be bound to and activated by antibodies. So there's a connection with our acquired immune system. All of this stuff, right? So the signals that are coming from our leukocytes, the histamine, the function of histamine, increasing blood flow to the area, all of our complement proteins coming in, you're bringing in your leukocytes, right? So your neutrophils and your macrophages to deal with those infectious particles. So essentially calling on all of your forces, marshaling your forces to show up. What you're going to get, right, are leukocytes that are full of pathogens. You're going to get dead pathogens who have been, possibly lysed by complement proteins or are otherwise rendered inactive. And any cell debris from damaged cells if it's an injury, or possibly, again, dead infected cells that have been killed by apoptosis, right, from our immune system response, or killed by the infectious particle, either way. So these injured and infected cells can also help trigger a systemic response. So far we've been talking about localized activity based on histamine's response to injured or infected cells. Those signals that are coming from those cells, basically cries for help, right, are triggering histamine production, which increases the blood supply and activates those leukocytes, right, and increases the delivery of those complement proteins, which are again also going to be activated by binding to pathogens. Our signals from our infected tissues and injured cells also will travel through your bloodstream and end up stimulating leukocyte production in your bone marrow, right? So this is why when you go to the doctor and you're getting a blood test and they want to check your white cell count, right, to see if you have an infection. So if you have an infection, basically your body will, through signals from these infected cells, ramp up production of, right, your first line of defense. So it's going to make more neutrophils, make more macrophages, make more natural killers, make more B cells and T cells to see if we can get our acquired immune system online and functioning in response to this particular infection. So that's part of the systemic response that we see to an injury or to an infection. And of course, possibly triggering a fever. We know that it works. Honestly, as far as I know, no one knows exactly how fever helps in a response to an infection. One of the hypotheses has to do with increasing body temperature beyond the ability of a lot of infectious particles to function. But we know that, right, having a fever for a prolonged period of time, meaning more than a couple of days, really high fever, can be fatal to people. So basically you could kill yourself as a result of your immune response. So it's one of those things that it works, but we're not quite sure how, and it's also a little bit dangerous to be playing around with. Okay, so here we have a kind of a typical situation where we have an inflammatory response as a response to an injury. So not an infection, but an injury. So you have the injured cells, right, are sending out signaling molecules in response to being damaged. And that is going to, in turn, trigger the release of histamine by the mast cells in our connective tissue. It's also going to recruit macrophages, right, and neutrophils to come and deal with any potential pathogens, which in this case we have bacteria that came in on the splinter, so they need to be dispatched. Histamine, of course, triggers the increase in blood supply to the particular area, increases the permeability of our capillaries so that neutrophils and macrophages can move from your bloodstream to the affected area more easily. We also have, as the increased blood supply brings in complement proteins, which are also going to deal with any infectious particles, right, by binding to those receptors on the surface that they recognize and opening up pores to allow the lysis of those microbes, in particular bacteria. As we can see in the second panel, right, we've got our neutrophils and macrophages are phagocytizing the bacteria. They may, again, also be expressing those on their surface, their MHC surface, in an attempt possibly later to recruit T cells as part of our acquired immune response. But more likely, they're just going to clean up all of this stuff. And of course, that's the pus that we get, right? If you've had an injury, you have, again, complement proteins, dead pathogens, and of course, our white blood cells that are full of pathogens that they're digesting. Basically, the cleaning crew arrives and deals with this. As they deal with it, right? Notice that there are fewer signaling molecules. So basically, as the damage gets cleared up, you have fewer cells crying for help, and that tends to reduce your histamine response, which means over time the swelling goes down, the blood flow returns to normal, and notice it says tissue heals. Well, that's going to take a bit, right? Because you actually have mitosis that has to happen in this case the skin to grow and knit that tissue back together again. So that might take a little bit of time, perhaps. Okay, so sometimes our inflammatory response basically gets out of control. So I mentioned we're not going to talk too much about allergies, but basically allergies are when you have an inflammatory response to something that's not a pathogen, but perhaps you've had it bind to receptors on your mast cells, and so it's releasing histamine, and you have this allergic, essentially you have an inflammatory response, but there is no actual infectious particle. So we're not going to go into that too much, really. But we will talk about here's an example of when you have an inflammatory response that's gone haywire. So septic shock is a situation where it's triggered by some bacterial infections that the infection tends to be in your actual bloodstream. And so essentially what's happening is histamine is being triggered almost everywhere, and your body is trying to increase blood flow in response to histamine everywhere all at once, right? Which we know from our discussion in the circulatory system EdPuzzle, we know what's going to happen with that, right? Your blood pressure is going to drop and for your whole body, right? So systemic blood pressure drops because you've dilated all your blood vessels, and you're trying to increase flow everywhere, and you only have so much blood, right? You have a limited supply. And so unfortunately what that means is not only the loss of blood pressure, but that your blood flow is more slow it's flowing more slowly through your capillaries. So blood takes longer to get to certain places, right? Which means oxygen takes longer to get to your cells. Cells are essentially starving for nutrients and oxygen. Septic shock is also characterized by a very high fever. Again, it's a systemic infection, so your body is basically trying to cook all of those microbes. And as a treatment, folks are trying to basically bring your blood pressure back up and block this particular response. At the same time, you want to deal with this infection that has spread everywhere, right? So you're trying to isolate what kind of infectious particle you have. Is it resistant to certain kinds of antibiotics, and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, this is something that does happen, and we get about 200,000 cases every year, and about 1/3 of those are fatal. So it's a real thing, and it's somewhat scary to have that happen to you. And other chronic inflammatory conditions, some of them are autoimmune disorders. So we talked about that when we talked about acquired immunity in class. So this is when your body is basically attacking itself. So you have either B cells or T cells, basically our lymphocytes, which are a type of leukocyte, but are lymphocytes that respond to very specific antigens. And we know when we resplice with recombinase, right, you resplice the genes that code for the receptors for B cells and T cells to increase the amount of pathogens that they can respond to, the variety of different types of receptors that they can bind to. When you do that, right, you sometimes will generate combinations that react to yourself. And that's why, of course, those cells are tested for self-reactivity before they're allowed to run willy-nilly through our body. But sometimes things get slipped through the cracks, right? So you get a cell that is responding to self-proteins as if they were foreign particles, and you didn't catch it before it sort of runs away. Then you have the potential to develop an autoimmune disorder. So common ones are cells that are attacking your digestive tract, the lining of your digestive tract. Among those are things like celiac, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, and so on. Of course, your cells are being attacked, so by yourself. So you have actually two problems. One is the fact that you have immune cells are targeting your healthy cells as if they were foreign bodies, but also those healthy cells that are being attacked are responding as if they were being attacked because they are. So they are generating a histamine, an inflammatory response in response to being damaged. And so that basically you have this kind of nasty feedback loop where this repeats itself over and over and over again. So I've just picked a couple of chronic inflammatory conditions, but there are quite a few, unfortunately. There's lupus and some others. Chronic fatigue syndrome, rheumatoid arthritis. Again, these are dealing with swelling in the joints, but it just depends on where those self-proteins are that are being recognized as foreign. Again, most common ones are your digestive system, but also could be your neurons, it could be your kidneys, it could be other types of tissue. Okay, so just to recap, right, we have, as part of our innate immunity, right, we've got barrier defenses. So the first line of defense is basically keeping foreign particles out in the first place, right? So skin, for us anyway, skin, we don't have a shell. Skin, mucus, secretions that contain lysozymes, for example, or acid, right? So low pH, mucus, other kinds of secretions like those hydrolytic enzymes that are present in our cells that are trying to take care of any foreign DNA that enters our cells. We have specialized cells whose job it is to respond to a broad range of pathogens. So again, viruses, bacteria, fungi. These are neutrophils and macrophages, as well as natural killers. Neutrophils and macrophages respond by phagocytizing any foreign particles that they recognize, bringing them inside. They may then display that on their surface of their MHC, major histocompatibility complex, in an attempt to recruit T cells as part of our acquired immunity. But their main job is basically cleaning up infectious particles. If they're activated by histamine, then they will also have some other responses, which is, again, increasing blood flow to wherever they're working. They also can be recruited by damaged cells that are essentially calling for help, and they will show up to deal with that. Natural killers go after a slightly different type of situation. They're generally targeting cancer cells or cells that are infected, and again are calling for help, the natural killer shows up and basically kills them. It triggers apoptosis, but natural killers are also looking for cells that are expressing abnormal proteins, basically cells that are behaving badly, and it kills them before they have a chance to cause any more problems elsewhere. We have the complement system, right? So you have proteins that are, again, going to respond to a wide variety of different kinds of molecules that are found not in ourselves, but are found in viruses and fungi and bacteria. And they can respond by basically making it harder for those things to infect cells. Also can essentially dispatch them by opening up pores in the membranes of the prokaryote and eukaryote cells. So complement proteins also can be involved in our acquired immune response because they can bind to antibodies and help to dispatch pathogens that way too. In response to the cries for help from damaged cells, particularly cells that have been infected with a virus, our leukocytes can produce interferons, which again helps to short circuit that infection by making it harder for viruses to infect other body cells. The infected cells themselves can produce interferons that also tend to reduce the level of viral infection. And then finally, of course, we have the histamine response, right? So the triggering of release of histamine by signals from infected or damaged cells. Essentially, they're crying for help. Histamine gets released. Histamine, again, is a local regulator, but it also can travel elsewhere in the bloodstream, but mostly it's going to be acting over a short distance to increase blood flow, increase the permeability of your capillaries so that your leukocytes can come and deal with any pathogens, right? And again, it attracts and activates our leukocytes, which in turn activate and attract complement proteins. So essentially, it brings the entire innate immune forces to bear on whatever localized problem you're dealing with in terms of an illness or an injury. This increases blood flow and the permeability, which also leads to the swelling that we associate with a histamine response. And sometimes that swelling, of course, as we know, can be problematic, right? Especially if you're having, for example, an allergic reaction to something, and the histamine is being triggered, release is being triggered in a particular area in response to something that's not actually an infectious pathogen, but instead is a different type of particle that's still triggering this allergic response. Most commonly in cases of anaphylactic shock. You have the swelling that gets triggered is around your trachea and your bronchioles in your lungs, and so the swelling is so severe that it actually is blocking your airway. It's constricting your airway, and you're essentially suffocating. You're choking. You can't get enough oxygen because you have an immune response that is gone haywire. In this case, a histamine response to something that's not actually an infectious particle. And typically, the best response to that, these are for folks who have these kinds of allergies that are this severe, is carrying what's called an EpiPen. And it's basically epinephrine. And epinephrine, as we know, right, binds to receptors in your bronchioles and causes them to, it's a vasodilator and it's a bronchial dilator. So it's causing it to expand, which restores the airflow until you can deal with and administer a histamine blocker to stop this allergic response. But in the meantime, it increases your airflow by dilating your bronchial tubes. So that is, in a nutshell, is our innate immune response, which we can see does cross over with our acquired immune response in terms of damaged cells and especially infected cells calling for help and possibly presenting particles on their surface of their MHC, which if a T cell recognizes that, the T cell will be activated and then can produce helper T cells and cytotoxic T cells, right? Cytotoxic T cells will deal with the infected cell and dispatch it. via triggering apoptosis. But also you have those helper T cells, which will in turn activate the cytotoxic T cells, but can also activate B cells that have that they encounter that have the same type of receptor, and B cells, right, can produce antibodies. And antibodies are basically just a liquid form of the receptor, but they function in a way somewhat like interferons in that they tend to reduce the ability of that pathogen to infect cells. So our acquired immune system, we have a two-pronged approach, but it's very, very specific to a specific type of antigen receptor. And our innate immunity is generally responding to a broader range of infectious particles.